Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone, and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, we are moving on with more in our A+ series, having a good time doing that, and joining us back in the studio, yet again, lending himself to us so that we might learn from him. Our good friend, Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, glad to have you again, man. How's it going?
Oh, man, it's going great. Going to be continuing on in control panel utilities. I got to say that right because we've been joking around off camera. I've been saying utilities. You watch. I'm going to end up throwing that here in this episode.
I trust you will. Wes.
That's right. We'll make our own contributions to the English language. Merriam-Webster, eat your heart out.
Right.
That's right. So, speaking of utilities, let's go ahead and let's continue on. In the first part, well, we really only talked about one utility, and it's kind of important because it comes down to web browsing, right? We talked about the Internet Explorer options, Internet options as they call them, but they're directly related to Internet Explorer. Now, we're going to move on, and some of the next things that we're going to talk about is, well, some of the display settings. And for the most part, these really haven't changed. We're going to kind of walk you through the different operating systems just so you can see the interface. Again, the interface is important because keep in mind, in some of the questions, they might have an exhibit that lets you look at something, and maybe a portion of it might be clickable, but you might not get that benefit, right? Because if I can see an exhibit, right, I could kind of deduce what's going on here, but if I only have a text-based answer, you better just deduce that you know exactly how to get there before you ever get into the exam booth, and that is important.
And you know what? You might think that's crazy, right? Like, why would they do it? They're just trying to make things difficult. And I would have probably been in that exact same camp up until I actually started working in the field. And sometimes, like, well, a lot of time we have remote desktop type of software, right? VNC, things of that nature. You log in, you do the thing, and you're done. But sometimes that doesn't work. And you have to walk them through it and you have to go, okay, on the top right-hand corner, there should be a button that says Categories or Classic View, Category View, Classic View. Click that. Where's that? Okay, it's going to be underneath the red X. You're going to have to really be able to paint them a picture and walk them through it if you can't actually log in or be there physically to do the work yourself. So don't think that this is outside of the scope of something that you would do as an A+ technician. You're almost guaranteed to actually have to do this.
Flying like Stevie Wonder with a driver's license, right?
It's frustrating and it's hard.
You have to know, exactly.
But you have to do it.
And if you think about it, yeah, it's frustrating on you, but it's also frustrating on the end user because the end user wants to help, and if they feel helpless, then it just elevates, you know, the whole problem a lot.
Doesn't help, that's for sure.
I know. Again, that's one of the good things about having you here on this one because Dan's worked in help desk, for many years now. So. Keep in mind that we're going to show you the different interfaces. Let's go ahead and I'll tell you what, we'll dive right in here. We're going to dive into Windows Vista first, right? And we're going to go to Appearance and Personalization. We're already in if you will, the Start menu. We've gone to Start, we've gone to Control Panel, and in our Personalization, you see that we do get some of the options here. Now, I want you to see that honestly, when we look here, I don't see a lot of the things that I'm supposed to be seeing, right? It's a little bit different because if you go to Control Panel in Windows 7 and you go to Appearance and Personalization, notice that I get this display option, right? Well, that's kind of interesting because, well, I don't see it from Appearance and Personalization right here. So that is one of the reasons we want you to be aware of display settings, right? Notice that it isn't here. It is a little bit different. You're going to look at personalization and you're going to get these display settings down here. Notice it is different, right? So that again is one of the things that you do have to keep in mind. And let me go ahead and just kind of recap that. If we back out to Appearance and Personalization and we go back to Control Panel Home, just keep in mind, still the same location as far as Appearance and Personalization. But again, notice that we don't get that display option. We have to go to Personalization, and then your display settings are down here at the bottom, and this is the display settings inside of Vista, right? So it is a little bit different where in Windows 7, all right, if we go to Control Panel, Appearance and Personalization, notice right there at the top we have Display. And the same thing goes with Windows 8 and 8.1, really. We go to Control Panel, we go to Appearance and Personalization, and yes, I know, wash, rinse, repeat, repetitive nature here, but we also have the display settings right here. Now, what can we do inside of the display settings? Well, obviously we can modify aspects and properties of the display. But I also want you to know that we can do things like, for instance, we can enlarge parts of the screen with what's known as the magnifier. Now, the magnifier tool is also in the ease of access center, but we can also change things like the text size and the scaling. This is where, in fact, I think, Nan, you had mentioned this in an earlier episode where we're talking about troubleshooting in the hardware section. We're talking about troubleshooting monitors and why the resolution might be off. Sometimes when you adjust these scaling sizes, right, and the text sizes, applications that open up won't be displayed right, and you're going to wonder what the heck is going on, and then you realize that in your zoom options, you aren't zoomed, but yet it's still off center. So keep that in mind, that can happen here. You can also do things like adjusting your resolution. Color depth, we can change and calibrate our color. We can also adjust things like the clear type text. All right, now you also have the ability, if you want, you can, for instance, if you go to adjust resolution, you also have the advanced settings here that you can control. And advanced settings, right, when we get into advanced settings, this is where you see more of the properties of the monitor itself. For instance, you look at the adapter, we can look at the adapter properties, same thing that we could see inside of Device Manager. But one of the things I want you to know is that even though this really isn't too much for us today, you can also modify not only things like color depth, but you can modify things like your refresh rate. Now, this used to be a thing you would have to know in the earlier A+ days. In some of the earlier exams that I used to teach, you used to have to know a little bit more about the refresh rate. We already talked about that being a characteristic of your monitors. Remember, refresh rate is how often the screen repaints itself. And anything lower than 60 hertz, what ends up happening is your eye, your optical nerve, it senses that it isn't a static picture, that it's actually being repainted, and it can pick up on that, and it can really give you headaches. One of the great things for today, this was more with your CRT monitors. I want you ladies and gentlemen to see something out here. It really isn't something that you can change too much, right? Notice that this says, hey, what's the native settings for this monitor, in this case a laptop that I'm on, and I don't have the ability to change anything. So that's really going to be more specific to the monitor that you're sitting in front of, but you really don't have any reason to change it below 60 hertz anymore, even though you might be able to set them, you might not. All right, so that is a little bit about, in Control Panel, if you will, that's a little bit about some of your display settings. Now, the other thing that we also have the ability to do is we have user accounts. All right, now, this depends on what control panel you're in. So, for instance, if we're in Windows 7, you'll notice that it says User Accounts and Family Safety. That's important. Again, I am picking semantics because, again, they might ask you to troubleshoot a Windows 7 machine, and if they say on the exam, start Control Panel, User Accounts, that isn't the right answer for Windows 7, right? That's the right answer for Windows 8.1. Now, semantics aside, if we get in here, User Accounts, keep in mind this is obviously where we can manage our user accounts. Now, we also showed you in a previous episode about computer management and the fact that inside of computer management, and I kind of want to just recall this to the top here if I get to computer management, because two different locations to manage your user accounts. One is local users and groups. The other one here is user accounts. However, I do want you to keep in mind that with user accounts here, all right, understand that the one thing you can't do in user accounts is make any modifications creating or modifying groups. That has to be in computer management. Could be something that you either get right or get wrong on the exam based on whether you are aware of it. So I would be, all right. Now, when we get into user accounts, we have the ability to do a couple of different things, right? You can change your own account. If you're managing other accounts, you have to be an administrative user. Remember, you're making potential changes to the core functionality of the operating system, so this does require you to be an administrator in order to manage these other accounts. Now, notice that I can add accounts here, right? In an earlier episode, we created Dan an account here too. And if I wanted to, I could see things like the properties of his account and group membership. Notice that I told you that you can't really modify groups here. One exception to the rule, and again, big exam alert. I can move him from a standard user to an administrator. Let's say when I first created this account, I already know Dan knows the insides and outs of this computer, and I mean that truthfully, right? I say, oh, well, I made him a standard user. That was my fault here. I need him to be an administrator. So now I get the ability, if I want, to basically make him an administrator. Now he's part of the administrator account, and you do have the ability to make modifications here to some of the basic users that you find in Windows 8.1. Now moving back over to user accounts and family safety in Windows 7, you'll see that if we choose user accounts as well, we can also manage other accounts here too. And I could, let's say for instance, let's create a new user here. And I'll create a new standard user. We'll call this student 02. We will create the account. And then maybe I want to do some basic management. All right. Notice that one of the things I can do is change the account type here. But there is a big difference in Windows 7, all right? Windows 7, I told you, does not give you the ability to modify the user in groups, if you will. That's only in Windows 8.1 that they gave you a way, essentially, that you can do this outside of local users and groups. So do keep that in mind. Windows 8.1, yeah, I have the ability. I can modify it. Up until Windows 8.1, Windows Vista and Windows 7, it's either a standard user or it is a administrative user account. All right, so that being said, let's go ahead and let's move on to some of the other things that you can do. All right, now there's a couple different ways that you can do this next functionality that we're going to talk about, right? And we'll show you a couple of the different interfaces, all right? Inside of your control panel, if we go Start, Control Panel, and then we go to, where is that going to be located? I believe it is in System and Security. Oh, and you know what? It is not in System and Security. Where did that end up? Appearance and personalization. Yeah. Thank you. And there's another example of a classic example of why I usually switch to the non-category view.
Yeah.
All right, so we have folder options here, and I'm going to show you another way that I am so used to getting to this that I don't even bother with the control panel, but we have to at least show you the exam objectives. And, well, you can see airball right there on camera. If I go to folder options, right, I get the ability, obviously, modify some of the ways that or Windows Explorer / File Explorer, depending on which operating system you're in, will be viewed, okay? Now, I also want you to understand that there's a couple different ways that you can get to this as well. So, if I open Windows Explorer from the taskbar, all right, and then I go up to Organize, and I scroll down to Folder and Search Options, I want you to know that it brings up the same exact menu, right? So Folder Options, again, from Windows Explorer, I can get to it, Organize, Folder and Search Options. And we'll look at these tabs here coming up here, just give me a moment. If I do this inside of Windows 8.1, or Windows 8 and 8.1, it's going to be, again, remember, it's going to be File Explorer. It's just a new thing that they call it today versus what they called it in Windows 7. Go ahead and close this down. Now, you might see something here that's missing. Notice that I don't have that Organize button here in File Explorer. That's because in File Explorer, they decided to go with the ribbon view that is really, really close to a lot of the other Microsoft products. For instance, your Office suite. Notice that I have the options over here, and if I choose options, I can choose change folder and search options. Now this is important, all right? So you can see that, right? I can show libraries, I can turn libraries off. Again, single click to open different items and stuff. Same thing with double click. But I will tell you that you also have this View tab. View tab is very important, and here are some of the things that I definitely want you to be aware of for the exam. All right, I can modify what you can see and what you can't see, certain aspects of Windows Explorer and File Explorer. Now the great thing is the View tab here is pretty much the same across the board here, so that you're aware of that. Notice this one right here, Show Hidden Files, Folders, and Drives. Now for the average end user, you really don't have to do too much to this, and a lot of times they don't. But you as a technician, you might need to see different hidden folders and files. Let me show you what I mean. Let me go ahead and I'm going to close this down, and what I'm going to do is I'll open File Explorer one more time, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to dive down into Local Disk C, and what we're going to look at is the user profile. And I'm going to go to Local Users, or excuse me, I'm sorry, Local Disk C. I'm going to go to Users, and remember these are where all of your user profiles are stored, and I'm going to get into, in this case, Admin, which is one of the user profiles on this machine. Now notice something. And I want you to pay attention right here around contacts. Notice that all of these folders, they're very, very dark. But there is times when you want to clear temp files out and you want to do it manually yourself. Well, where do you do that? Well, according to the default view, you can't see this hidden file or folder that's here. It's called app data. So what I would have to do, and again, this is specific to Windows 8.1, I'd go to folder options and I could change folder and search options on the ribbon, and I could choose view, and notice that I can choose show hidden folders and files, right? And I could click this and then apply it, or say OK to it. If you say OK, it closes the dialog box down, and you click apply. It still does the same thing, but it leaves the dialog box open. And if I go back up here, I can see app data, right? And I could drill down into app data, local, and then I can see all the various temp files here, and I could potentially clear them out if I want to. All right, now, in Windows 7, if we do this, it isn't really too much different. The only difference here is that we have the Organize button over in Windows Explorer. Same thing with Vista as well. And I have folder and search options. I have the View tab. Notice by default, Show Hidden Files and Folders isn't selected. Select the radio button, choose Apply, and then I could do the same thing. I could come in here to Computer, Local Disk C, Users, Admin. Sure enough, there's that hidden file or hidden folder app data. Go into Local and then Temp as well. But one of the things that the ribbon bar does in Windows 8.1 I kind of like is the fact that when you choose View, I want you to notice something right here. All right, if I choose Options, oops, let me get back to View. I don't need to choose the options. Notice hidden items right here, right on the ribbon. I can do that right here without opening up folder options. And that's kind of cool to have that. Now, the other one that I also want you to know is hiding file extensions. Notice it says file name and extensions right here on the ribbon, so I could do this in 8.1 right from the ribbon. But I also want you to know as a control panel utility that if I choose, again, our folder options dialog box, that I can do this from that same View tab. I can go to View tab, and if I scroll down just a little bit, you'll see that we have hide extensions for known file types, right? And I could uncheck this. It would be the same thing in Windows 7 and Vista, and I could choose Apply. And now when I come back, now I see what are the different file extensions, and that might be important for you on the exam. So that's some of the things that you can do there. You also have things like your general options, and here I'll switch back to Windows 7 here, kind of all over the place, just to show you the different kind of views that you have. Right, we got our general options where you can do, again, single click versus double click. Again, do you want to see all folders? And what that would do is that would modify the hierarchical view here on the other side. Search functionality, again, how to search and different options that you can do, non-index locations and what to search. So we can also modify those. Now, if you have somebody that goes in here and they make all different kinds of clicks and you want to restore the defaults, you can just click this button right here. You can choose Apply, and then you'll notice if we go back to the View tab, keep in mind that it'll reset essentially a lot of the settings that could get messed up in here. All right, so that's a little bit about your folder options. We do have some other things that we want to look at in the control panel. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch over here. We're going to kind of stay in Windows 8.1 for a little bit because we've been dealing with Windows 7 as well, and we want to kind of give you, you know, options essentially. Maybe not folder options, we just gave you that, but additional options, right? So I'll go to Control Panel, and now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at System, okay? Now, System is important. We've kind of looked at it in other ways where we've right-clicked on the Windows charm here, and we've chose System here from this menu as well. You could also, I guess I will show you Windows 7, because you can also get to here choosing the Start button, right-clicking, let's try to right-click there, Wes. We can right-click, and we can also choose Properties, and it's going to get us to the same location. Notice it's Control Panel, System Security, and System. So just wanted to show you a few different ways that you can get to it. So looking at System, one of the things that I'm really worried about here on the exam are performance settings, as well as remote settings, and then things like system protection. And the great thing is you have these different task links that allow you to get to these locations, right? So for instance, if I choose remote settings, this brings up your system properties, and it really just starts you out on different tabbed locations, right? Notice this is remote but guess what? Notice there's system protection right next to it. Well, you could probably only imagine where this hyperlink's going to take you, right? System protection, it takes you to system protection tab. All right, and then finally advanced system settings, right? It takes you to the advanced option, right? So system protection, this is where we can turn on system protection as well as manipulate and utilize the system restore functionality that we've talked about pretty extensively in other episodes. So we're not going to go into it too much here, basically restoring your configuration of your operating system to an earlier point in time through something known as a restore point. Remote, right? This is where we can turn on remote desktop. Understand remote desktop allows me to connect back to this machine and control the desktop as though I was sitting locally logged into the machine. Very good in those situations like Dan was saying where maybe you do have that option where you don't have to walk a user through everything. You can actually connect to their machine, take control over the desktop, and you can make the modifications and then disconnect and they can log back in. However, there might be certain scenarios where you want to actually show them. Maybe you've tried to go through the step-by-steps and somebody just doesn't really know where to click around. Well, remote assistance, which is on by default, unlike a remote desktop disabled by default, exam alert, allows somebody to connect to this machine and actually view at the same time what's going on. So that's important. We can share control over the desktop. And Dan essentially could, if he wanted to, he could see what they're seeing, they could see what he's seeing, and essentially they could share the control of the desktop in which it would allow Dan to walk through the process of whatever it might be that he needs to fix, or myself, and then the end user can also see it as well. All right. One of the next things I want to talk about is on that advanced tab that we have back here. Notice there is the performance option. Performance option is important because this is where you can set different visual effects, if you will. Again, keep in mind it depends on what your CPU utilization is. If you're adjusting for best performance, it's going to strip some of these down and try to save you processing power. Adjust for best appearance means that you have the resources within your machines to give you the best graphical user interface experience possible. Advanced, this is where you can see processor scheduling. I think processor scheduling is a little bit beyond the scope of this exam, but page file, right? We talk about virtual memory. Keep in mind that virtual memory essentially is a way that you have something known as a VMM, a virtual memory manager. And what the virtual memory manager does is it allows you to take data that isn't currently being used in your physical RAM and then basically page it or write it to the hard drive. And the virtual memory manager can swap information in and out of the hard drive and RAM. And this is really good for systems that in the earlier days had limited amounts of physical memory. Right? Well, again, remember memory. It is a temporary workbench. The more of it I have, the more I could be working with at one time. However, as it starts to get full, applications might call on a location in memory and don't have it. The virtual memory manager could then take that information out of RAM that isn't currently being utilized and page it or write it to the hard drive, and then allow an application to continue to consume memory and be able to work rather than the application freezing, hanging up, or not being able to work at all. And it's transparent to the application. That's why they call it a page or a swap file, because it's swapping data in and off of the hard drive. Now, Microsoft recommends that whatever your physical RAM is, so let's say 2 gigs, that your paging file be set to 1.5 times whatever the physical RAM is installed. So if you have 2 gigs of RAM, well, guess what? 1 times 2, right, is 2, and then another 1.5. Essentially, what you're going to have is a 3 gig page file. However, a lot of times it's better to just let Windows manage this, and this is where we can do that, automatically manage the page file for all drives. If we didn't want to do this, we could always do a manual configuration here on each individual drive, but we're not going to do that right now. Because even though it looks like I made changes, I didn't make changes to it. So keep in mind that if you do make changes to that, it requires a restart to the operating system. One of the things that they do talk about is sometimes you can optimize performance, because remember, your hard drive is constantly doing reads and writes, or your operating system is constantly doing reads and writes with a paging file. Well, if you take that paging file and you move it to a separate drive, then the operating system and all the applications that are using the existing hard drive don't have contention with the paging file. So that's called page file optimization. Again, with systems today having so much memory in them, it's not that we don't necessarily use the paging file. Certain applications are still geared to look for it. However, it's not really much of an issue today as it was in earlier days. All right. A couple of the last things I kind of want to round off here. They talk about control panel utilities. I do want to mention just briefly in the control panel, if you go to System and Security, System and Maintenance, if you're inside of Windows Vista, System and Security, and Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 is the Windows Firewall. We've kind of already talked about the Windows Firewall in other episodes where we talked about the features. We really did talk about this a lot, but I do want to mention it as a control panel utility. Keep in mind that it is what allows you to, or an application to communicate inbound to your, from the network to your system. By default, as a recap, remember that the Windows Firewall blocks all traffic coming into your system unless you allow that application to communicate through the firewall. It's called creating an exception. By default, all outbound traffic is allowed. And again, you can see some of the things that you can do here, changing the intrusive nature of the notification settings. I don't like to do this. I like to be aware when things are attacking my computer, because if I turn off the notifications, I don't really know that something's happening. And then this isn't really recommended, but you could turn off or on the firewall, or turn it on or off. We'll try a better English there, Dan. If things get hosed up a little bit too much, you can always restore them to the original defaults. And then if you're a little bit more tech savvy, you can always use the Windows Firewall with advanced settings. All right. Last thing on the list that we want to talk about just briefly is what are known as power options, or power plans as they're called today. Let's go ahead and go to System and Security, and you will see power options here. Now, if we get into power options, I want you to keep in mind that there are a few different plans here. There are 3 different plans. Now, you might say, well, Wes, I only see 2 of them on the screen. Well, that's because if I choose this little drop down arrow, you'll see that there is another one in here, high performance, but by default they kind of hide it, just especially if you're on a laptop. Let's talk about these different power plans. In the earlier days, and even in command prompt today, they're still called power schemes. In fact, there is a command prompt command that I want you to be aware of that's associated with power options, and it's called power cfg.exe. And this allows you the ability to modify this from command prompt. I don't really think they're going to get too much in depth because there is a lot of stuff that you have to be aware of. Let me see if I can remember real quick. Power cfg. I think it's list. Yeah, and you can see things like you have to know power GUIDs, right? You can see the power plans inside of here, and I can see with the asterisk symbol, kind of like we talked about with disk management, that this is the one that's currently selected. So I just bring that up there as a little tidbit in case they ask you on the exam. Now, going back to power plans, again, this defines how power is treated, or how your operating system will treat the hardware if you're on battery power versus if you are plugged into the AC outlet or the power adapter, if you will. All right, you can do things like requiring a password on wake up, right? You can choose what the power button does on the machine. You can see I can even create power plans if I want. When it comes to these 3 different power plans, balanced is one that, like you can see, and you guys could probably pause it and sit there and read or read along with me, but notice it says automatically balances performance with energy consumption on capable hardware. What the heck does that mean? All right. What it means is that if you need CPU power, it's going to ramp up the CPU. It's going to give you the processing power that you need. When you're not using CPU intensive applications, it throttles them. It slows it down. All right, that's why they call it balanced. If you need the processing power, you're going to get it. If you're not utilizing hardware and CPU utilization, you're going to reduce the voltage, or it will reduce the voltage to the system, trying to prolong the battery life. Power saver. Notice it says saves energy by reducing your computer's performance where possible. What does this mean? Well, this means it's going to throttle the CPU whether you need the power or not. So be careful on this one because it does reduce the performance just like it says. It means that we're going to throttle the CPU, and it doesn't matter if you launch an application that requires that processing power. And that's why they say it could affect performance, right? High performance says we don't care about conserving anything. We're going to run it wide open right until your battery just fails, right? And not fails, but runs out of juice. So do keep that in mind. All right. Last thing I want to mention here is that there are a couple of different low power modes that you have to be aware of. There is what is known as sleep or suspend. I've heard it called quite a few different things, right? Sleep, suspend, standby, if you will. And it's just different classifications, and as it's gone through the Windows versions, it's called something different, right? We'll call it sleep. The other one's hibernate, okay? So what is the difference between these two? All right, well, sleep, what it does is it shuts down all power, goes into a low power mode by shutting down all of your devices, with the exception of RAM. It keeps an electrical current still refreshing the information that's inside of your random access memory, meaning it's retaining your data. All right, here's the problem. While that's good and it does conserve your battery life, it means if that battery finally loses power, you lose power to your RAM, guess what? You also lose your data. So you got to be careful, right? It does prolong the battery life, but you do have a potential to lose your information. Hibernate, what's the difference between that? Well, hibernate does something a little bit different. It powers everything down, including your RAM, but not before it takes the entire contents of RAM and writes it to the hard drive. That's called a hyperfill.sys file, by the way, so just in case they ask you on the exam. I remember it as the hibernation file, hyberfil.sys, right? It's basically all the contents of your RAM. And what's interesting is when your computer goes through a normal boot process, the Windows Boot Manager says, before it even looks at the kernel file that's on the hard drive, it says, wait, do I find the hyperfill.sys file? Oh, okay, I see there's something there. That means there's hibernation state data in it. In fact, I'm not even going to mess with a normal kernel file and do a normal bootstrap. I'll just pull that file and dump it back into RAM, and then you resume from there. So the benefit is you get the power saving that you need to prolong your battery life, but at the same time, you don't lose your data. So why would you use one over the other? Well, it really just comes down to how fast do you want to resume from a low-powered state. All right, you don't go through the full boot process that you would in a hibernation state, but fastest resume is coming back from the sleep mode. Now, Windows has and most of the operating systems have some kind of hybrid method. They actually have, fast reboot or fast standby, I believe it is. It's a hybrid, and what this actually does is it does the same thing with the hyperfill SYS file, but it also does it in a sleep mode. So what it does is it goes into sleep and it keeps your RAM refreshed, but right before it did that, it wrote everything to the hard drive. So you kind of get the best of both. If you lose power, you still have the hyperfill file. So that's actually kind of cool. I think it's called fast standby is what it's called. But it's not something that's just unique to Windows. Linux has been doing this for a while. I think Windows just recently jumped on board. It's why we have ultra-fast reboot times today, and it's sometimes coupled with solid state. Your systems basically will reboot or resume so fast today. So those are a few of the things to keep in mind when it comes to your power options. Be aware of the different types. Also be aware of some of the files that we've set and all the different paths when it comes to getting into these control panel utilities, because I can tell you the one way you like to get to them probably won't be the way they ask you on the exam, and it can save you not only a lot of time and effort in your help desk experience, but it also can help you to pass that exam by getting some of these easy softball pitch questions right just by knowing the different paths to get to these utilities.
All right, Wes, a lot of great utilities found inside of the control panel and Windows operating system. So as he's been alluding to, get familiar with them, get comfortable with working with them, and find those multiple ways in which you can access them, because like you said, you never know which one they're going to throw at you, and it's usually the one that's your weakest. I don't know how they know, but they know. They're smart people over at CompTIA. All right, Wes, thanks for joining us today, and we do thank our audience for watching, but looks like it is that time, ladies and gents, for us to sign off. For IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.